Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Newton Community Farms YouTube channel. My name's Hope, and today we'll be talking about gardening. Every Wednesday at 1, we've been doing this gardening show, so if you ever want to look back at previous episodes that you may have missed or you'd like to revisit, they're all on this YouTube page. And for today's conversation and every conversation, I encourage viewers to ask questions or leave comments in the chat box. So that's either over there or down there somewhere. I'm not sure. Yeah, it's always fun to interact with viewers and make this a more collaborative process. So feel free to add anything into the chat box and I'll try my best to address it. So this gardening show has been fun because I think this whole health crisis and this pandemic has inspired a lot of folks to start thinking about where their food comes from in a new way. And, you know, for those of us who live in Massachusetts with a lot of security around food, generally speaking, it's been an interesting experience, I think, for a lot of us to go into grocery stores, especially at the beginning of all of this back in March, and not be able to get everything that we needed. I think it was the first time that maybe a lot of us have experienced scarcity around food. And I think that inspired a lot of folks to start thinking about their own autonomy over food and their own ability to take care of themselves and grow their own food, even if it's on a small scale, even if it's a windowsill garden or a pot of basil. I think it's inspired a lot of reclaiming that autonomy around food, which is really exciting to me. And I think it's exciting to our organization at Newton Community Farm in general, because that's the work that we're trying to do, is bringing more food autonomy and local food access to our communities. So with that being said, I hope that these videos can be even a small stepping stone in your journey toward more food autonomy and local food systems. It's important. So before we jump into the episode and its content, I'd like to share Newton Community Farm had a really successful seedling sale, not this past weekend, but the one before, where we sold a lot of our inventory, a lot of the crops that we had been growing in seedling form for folks to bring home and plant in their own gardens. So that was exciting. And the excitement continues because we have some overstock, some leftover inventory that's on sale right now on our homepage. So if you go to newtoncommunityfarm.org, you can see the instructions for logging in and placing an order. We're open right now. The online store is open right now. And we will be open until tonight or until we sell out. And we sold out pretty early with the regular seedling sale, the big one. So this is a mini seedling sale, so we'll see how long the inventory lasts. And pickups for this round will be on Friday afternoon, so this upcoming Friday in the afternoon. So with that being said, let's dive into today's content, which is gardening leafy greens. So I think salad greens and, chard and kale and all of those big favorites, I think those can be really exciting to grow in our own gardens or on our balconies or whatever spaces we're growing in. But they can have some there are some considerations with growing leafy greens in general. So we'll talk a little bit about that today and hopefully ensure some success in our efforts with that, because there's nothing better than going out back and picking our own lettuce and being able to take it inside and wash it and turn it into something delicious. So for the sake of today's conversation, leafy greens, the term leafy greens is just going to be a pretty broad collection of vegetables. So in that umbrella of leafy greens, I'll include lettuce, arugula, spinach, kale, chard, collard greens, mustard greens, all of those classics that we think of when we hear the term leafy greens. And I'll include cauliflower and broccoli and cabbage and those crops that aren't necessarily harvested for their greens, but as they grow in our gardens and in the field, they are like a big bushy leafy green plant. So all this to say, it's a wide breadth of different crops. And for the sake of today's conversation, I'll kind of split them up into two really loose groups. We'll do salad greens and we'll do brassicas. And then there's going to be like a little bit of a middle ground with some that don't quite fall into either. But I think in terms of discussing like very specific, crop specific and family specific tactics for ensuring success with these crops, it's helpful to kind of have them under some sort of vague umbrella to help organize them in the conversation. So salad greens. So for today, we'll say that includes head lettuce, that includes cut lettuce. So the difference there is, I've direct seeded. So I've put seeds directly in the soil, covered them up, and I've been watering them and letting them just kind of grow free. That's like a mixed lettuce or a cut lettuce. There's a lot of different names for it. Or maybe there's only two different names for it, and those are them. Which is different from a head lettuce, which if you've bought that from the seedling sale or if you've grown it from seed yourself inside, those you plant once they're a little start of a plant. You plant them in a neat little row. So for the sake of today's conversation, we have head lettuce, we have cut lettuce, we have arugula, we have spinach, anything that you would include in a raw salad, for example, that would fall under salad greens for today. So a lot of these crops, a lot of salad greens, they're cool weather crops, which does not mean they can't grow and thrive in the summertime, but it means that they'll require a little bit of extra attention and care when it gets hot, like today. So cool weather crops, these are typically things that you would see planted at Newton Community Farm, for example, earlier in the spring. So as soon as the soil warms up, meaning as soon as it's not frozen, as soon as the ground's not frozen, we can start to plant some lettuce, some spinach, some things that can handle a frost or two. And most of these leafy greens can, which is almost counterintuitive because lettuce is so delicate and fragile. And I always thought of it as something that needed heat. Like I thought cold would demolish such a delicate plant, but it's surprising it doesn't. But on the flip side, lettuce isn't always as happy in heat. It's typically not happy in heat. So knowing the preference of your lettuce variety, so whether you're buying that from us or you're seeding it yourself and getting your seeds elsewhere, typically if you have the variety name of whatever kind of greens you're growing, you can look up online or in a seed catalog the different preferences of that plant, of that specific variety, and kind of try to cater to those a bit. Because there are varieties of lettuce that are bred, I guess is the right word, to survive in winter, and there are some that are going to survive in summer. So knowing the varieties that you're growing is kind of step number one for getting them into a position that will make them happy as they grow. And they tend to germinate best in cooler soil. So if you're, right now the soil will be cool enough for lettuce or cut lettuce or arugula to get planted in, but it's heating up as we can all feel today. So something like, if you want to plant lettuce later in the season, you can always lay down straw or hay, which tends to cool the soil down a little bit. So if you lay that for a few days, that's one way to get the soil to cool off a bit before you plant a heat-sensitive crop like lettuce. On the other side of the conversation, so we've got salad greens, touched upon that. Now we have brassicas, which they have a lot of overlap, a lot of the same kind of needs. A lot of brassicas are frost tolerant, they're heat sensitive, just like the greens we talked about. And they're a pretty big family. A lot of everybody's favorite crops are in this family. So kale is a brassica, broccoli and cauliflower are brassicas. So it's helpful to know what falls under this category because they have some different needs from other greens like arugula and lettuce and all that, and chard. But they're also susceptible to pests. So brassicas, because they're such a wide family and they include so many crops, pests can jump from brassica to brassica. So it's helpful to know not only for care purposes, but for being conscious of the pests that we see in our gardens. It's important to know, I think, if your crop falls under the brassica umbrella. So we'll talk about a couple of different kind of categories of care and how they apply to these different families of greens. So the first I would say is soil and moisture. So, we think of the main things that crops need. It's nutrients, which is basically its food, and that's in the soil. So thinking about how healthy our soil is before we plant things, it's useful because that's pretty much food security for our crops. So if we put our crops in less than ideal soil, they won't be as healthy as if we, added compost in the beginning or something like that. And then water and sunlight. So we're going to talk about all of those. So we'll start off with soil and moisture. So for leafy greens, like salad greens, so, our lettuce, our arugula, our spinach, all of those, they grow best in rich soil. They like a lot of organic matter. They respond best to that. So adding compost, which by nature adds organic matter to the soil, it's a good idea to maybe rake some of that in before you plant, or if your greens are already in the ground, you can just kind of sprinkle some compost around your greens to give them a little boost of nutrients. But the more organic matter, the better. That might not be true. There might be such a thing as too much organic matter, but adding some organic matter to the soil is going to benefit these specific types of leafy greens. And then most of these plants, so for example, a head of lettuce, it has shallow roots. So for watering purposes, that means that, if this is the soil column in your garden bed, like that, a head of lettuce will only access water in the top kind of quadrant of your soil bed. This is not a very great representation of what I'm trying to say. But all this to say, basically, a head of lettuce and other greens like lettuce that fall into this salad green category that I've created, they will respond best to frequent watering rather than deep watering. So some crops respond well to a nice deep watering, and then they can hang out for a couple of days before they need it again. With lettuce and arugula and the like, they respond best to frequent watering, constant moisture, but it doesn't need to be deep. Just sprinkling daily or twice a day if it's hot is a good way to keep them happy, keep them from wilting, kind of help encourage like big, healthy, succulent leaves on these crops. And another little hint, tip, whatever, to growing heat-sensitive crops like a head of lettuce is to use your other plants in your garden as some kind of like a shade for these heat-sensitive crops in the height of summer. So the last episode I did last Wednesday, which is called, I think, Companion Planting, I share a little bit about how to pair up plants, mostly to save space, but also to cater to the individual needs of each plant. So lettuce is heat sensitive. You could pair it up with crop like cucumber, which vines out over the soil, typically shades the area between each cucumber plant in a row, and creates a cooler kind of microclimate underneath its leaves. And there's usually enough space to pop in a head of lettuce between them. It's usually happier than it would be in all day beating direct sunlight. So if you're curious about saving space and kind of catering to those needs of fragile, heat-sensitive plants, you can check out that episode. On the other hand, there's brassicas. And in the summertime, everything's going to require a lot of water. The more it heats up, the quicker the water evaporates and is used by the plant. So regular watering is just important across the board when things heat up. But for brassicas, it's important to think about, because they are pest prone, it's important to think about, making sure they have enough water, but not overdoing it so that they're sitting in constantly moist soil. Or moist is good, but I would say constantly like sopping soil wouldn't be great for brassicas, because that leaves them more susceptible to soil-borne disease, and like root rot and things like that. They prefer overhead watering rather than drip tape. So if you've invested in drip tape, it might be best to assign that to a different crop, something like tomatoes, rather than using it for your brassicas, because typically they don't respond very well to having water coming in at the root level. And if you just use a hose like me, then you're lucky, because you can just spray them down and they'll be happiest that way. And a lot of this is site specific. So all of this kind of general information, it's going to change. It's going to be site dependent. So you just keep an eye on how your plants are responding. And if they look bushy and happy and green, then you're probably giving them the right amount of water and the right amount of soil nutrient, and the right amount of space, especially brassicas. They like a lot of space between plants. So yeah, just kind of staying in tune with how your plants are responding to how you care for them is a really important step in the process. It's like reading online and watching online tutorials is like step one, and then there's so much more that you'll get to do on your own, by kind of like reading the room of your garden, so to speak. I'm coining a lot of strange phrases today that don't really have to do with plants and gardening, but we're here, we're doing this thing. So the next consideration for all plants, but today for leafy greens, is pests and disease. So for greens, they're not, they're susceptible. Everything's susceptible. More so they're susceptible to like rabbits, I would say, and different like little critters coming in for dinner in your garden. And we'll talk about a couple preventions for that when we talk about harvesting. But there are a lot of kind of like, how do I want to word it? Like little teeny tricks that you can try. I've heard like pet hair around your garden can deter bunnies, and I've heard coffee grounds can do that. So there's a lot of little hacks for pests. There's also just row cover. Row cover is good for bugs and for rabbits. So that's something to look into if you're concerned about pests of any kind. But for the sake of brevity, we'll just talk about brassicas and disease, because it's typically a big part of growing brassicas is safeguarding them from I guess I'll say inevitable disease, but that's a little gloomy. It's more than possible to grow very healthy brassicas. So again, brassicas are a big family. A lot of crops are included in brassicas. And knowing which of your crops are brassicas is helpful, because you can attend to them with a little bit more care. So on the farm, we use row cover over our brassicas all the time in the field, even in the middle of summer. From what I understand, there's row cover that is good for keeping in heat, and then there's row cover that's just pretty much for bugs and other pests. So, if you're concerned about a disease from last year in your soil, or if you've read about certain diseases that are prevalent in your area that might attack your kale and you want to prevent it, you can always look into row cover. There are a few a number of other things that you can do just day to day as you go into your garden. If you see bugs or eggs of bugs on your plants, you can take care of them, kill them, squish them, move them somewhere else if you don't want to kill them. Just take care of them if you see them, get them out of your garden. If you're out weeding and you notice a bunch of beetles on your kale, it's good to address them when you see them so that they don't continue to spread out and infect more plants. If you see one infected plant in your garden, if it has some kind of like a rot, or if it's just like looking like it might have a fungus or something funky on its leaves, you can just remove that and fill it in with something else. Because if one plant has an infection or a disease, I don't know if plants can get infections. If it has a disease, it can spread through your garden to other plants. So it's a good idea to just kind of take care of it while you can. Early prevention or something like that. Crop rotation, which is a little bit more relevant to like in between seasons, but if you're planting, kale in the spring and then you're going to pull those plants midsummer and plant something else, crop rotation means, not planting kale in the exact same spot every time you're planting. And the next step up from that would be not planting brassicas in the same exact spot every time you're planting. So, if you're going to plant kale in one bed in May, then you could plant carrots in that bed in July, keeping it, rotating it. So, so that the nutrients that one crop needs aren't depleted every time you plant it. So the soil would be depleted by constant rotation of kale after kale after kale, because the same plant will require the same set of nutrients. But if you're rotating, then the nutrients that the kale used can be replenished while a different crop from a different family exists and grows in that soil and requires different nutrients and minerals and such. So yeah, that applies to soil health and also crop pest disease. Yeah. And then there is an earlier episode on that way back, probably in March. It's called Families of Vegetables, another gardening episode on our website. So if you're curious about learning more about crop rotation and how that can, prevent disease and improve soil health, you can go back in time and watch that, because it's important to consider, especially if you'll be growing on the same land season after season. And the last disease pest action that you can take, preventative measure that you can take, is just continuous regular harvest. So I think it can be tempting to leave our gardens looking like lush and full and really pretty and productive, but it's not great for pests or animals coming in. So if we aren't harvesting when things are ready, that invites bunnies and bugs to come in and feast on all the ripeness that's in our garden. So constant regular harvest is it's a great measure for keeping things safeguarded to some degree against pests and against little critters. So we'll talk quick about harvesting. I think that's kind of like far away from some of our minds as we're thinking about planting and prepping soil and kind of just getting into the swing of our season here. But especially salad greens, they grow pretty fast. So having a little bit of, understanding of what to expect and what to do with harvesting is helpful, even this early in the game if you haven't planted yet. So for harvesting brassicas, we'll start there. An important consideration is to keep them cold. If you can keep like broccoli on ice, that's a good thing to do. But they definitely need to stay cold once harvested. And that's pretty much true of everything in the summertime, but especially brassicas. So for cabbage, It'll grow with all these big leaves coming out the sides, and then there'll be a head of cabbage in the middle. And typically, it's ready if you like pinch the sides and there's not much give. If it's pretty firm, it's probably ready to be harvested. For cauliflower is a one harvest kind of a crop. So once it reaches, like, they say 6 to 8 inches, but I feel like I can't imagine. It's hard to imagine length in my mind in terms of inches and feet. So basically, once that's firm and once it's somewhat sizable, and again, that's different for every variety, depending on what variety of cauliflower you're growing. I try not to look in my garden for like grocery store size or quality crops. Sometimes when we're growing organically in our yards with whatever level of experience we have and whatever varieties we have, we likely won't always end up with crops looking like they look in the grocery store. So keeping that in mind when waiting for your crops to be ready. There's other signs to look for besides like a huge head of cauliflower. With broccoli, we're also kind of looking for like tight, green, pretty heads, like any size really, but a lot of broccoli varieties won't get to the grocery store size. And you can get a few harvests on broccoli. They'll probably be smaller every time, but you can cut one head when it's ready and the next one will come through. The first time I saw broccoli growing, I was amazed because it really is this huge green, leafy, lush plant. And you kind of peel back the leaves and there's a broccoli inside. It's so cool. So if you're growing broccoli for the first time, you are in for a treat. Brussels sprouts, which I've never grown, but are also kind of, for the sake of the conversation, under this leafy green category. You harvest those from the bottom up, and that's about all I know about Brussels sprouts. But we sold those at the seedling sale, so I'm very excited to hear from folks on how those come out. Kale and collards and chard, they all grow in similar patterns. When you harvest, I wish I could have like a fake kale plant here with me. When you harvest those, typically once the leaves are 8 to 14 inches, somewhere like above or below a foot long, you can harvest those in bunches starting at the bottom. So the newer leaves will come in at the top in the center. And sometimes I tend to notice when a kale plant, for example, is ready to be harvested, especially dino kale, I forget the name, dino kale. The bottom leaves will almost flop out under their own weight. And then you can just snap them off around the base and bunch them up and they're ready to go. Always just leaving a few leaves left, smaller leaves or leaves that don't look as green up on the top. It's important to leave some leaves left because the plant still needs to photosynthesize and make food. So that's how we harvest there. And then Bok Choy is another green, really fragile leaves. You can harvest it as a head, like cut the whole thing at the stem, or leaf by leaf, but those are fragile. Really quick before we wrap up, harvesting salad greens. For leaf lettuce or arugula, that's kind of growing in a patch as opposed to a neat bunch in a row. Keeping those leaves short and cropped keeps the plants producing well into the summer. And it also sends the signal to the plant to continue growing and producing leaves rather than signaling to the plant that it should stop producing leaves and bolt, which means to go to seed, and then it's no longer edible. So taking off those large leaves is basically for these salad greens, it's the way to keep them continuously producing through the season or through half the season, however long they'll be in the ground. With head lettuce, that takes a little bit more time to develop, but they're still pretty quick growers. These are single harvest, and in the summer, those can also bolt. So if you've ever seen a head of lettuce bolting, it's like growing up like a tower rather than out like a head of lettuce that we see in the store. To prevent that from happening prematurely, just harvest them as soon as they look big enough. And it's a good way to avoid pests, and it's a good way to kind of get it out of the ground while it's still edible and a decent size, especially in the heat. Lettuce heads can bolt prematurely. But bolted lettuce isn't bad. It's a little bit more bitter. So that's a overview of growing leafy greens. I hope that it's whatever's in the ground for you is going well. If anyone's had any harvest so far, that's really exciting. I've loved hearing from some community members about what they're growing and questions that they've had and how everything's going, especially with seedlings that they've gotten from the farm. I had my first harvest of my basil plants the other day, and it was really exciting, just stepping right outside and having access to something edible that I can bring inside and create something with. So I hope that you all get to have that experience soon. And yeah, always reach out to us at Newton Community Farm. We love hearing about what our community members are doing. And again, we have our mini seedling sale that's going on this week. Go to our website, newtoncommunityfarm.org, if you're interested in purchasing anything. Pickup is on Friday. All right. Good luck with gardening. Good luck with leafy greens, and stay healthy. We'll see you next week. Bye, everyone.